I'm Mara Gladstone. I'm so thrilled to be moderating this panel of writers talking about writing. And what an amazing panel we have here. To stage left, Bernardine Evaristo. Bernie is the author of 10 books, including her most recent autobiography, Manifesto on Never Giving Up, which was super inspiring. Bernardine's win of the Booker Prize for Girl, Woman, Other in 2019 was an extraordinary moment in literary history, as she is the first Black woman and the first British Black person to receive the Booker Prize in its 50-year history as the top English language literary prize. She's also president of the Royal Society of Literature, the second woman and the first person of color in its 200 years to hold this title. Pretty amazing. Susan Choi is the author of 5 novels and a children's book, and her second novel, American Woman, was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. Her most recent book, Trust Exercise, is a slim and elegant and kind of cunning novel, and it won the National Book Award. Most recently, her story Flashlight won the biggest prize for short stories, the 2021 Sunday Times Audible Short Story Prize, which was published in New Yorker. And Jonathan Safran Foer has written 6 books, including his first novel, the critically acclaimed Everything Is Illuminated. And over the last several years, he's become a leading voice in advocating for vegetarianism and climate change, most recently with the book, We Are the Weather. So I guess starting this conversation about writing, I myself come from an academic background, but regardless, I have learned that reading all kinds of texts, ones you love and ones you hate, make you a better writer. And because you're really accomplished voices of our time, of this moment, as I read your books, I really felt, even if they were written 10, 15, 20 years ago, there's something that feels very here and now. I'd really love to start by asking you about your inspirational origins as writers, because before you wrote, you likely read. So what book or text do you first recall reading with pleasure? Is there a text that imprinted in your mind that said to you, I'm going to become an author? I mean, it could be something, not even a long book, but just something that triggered or imprinted.
Well, my first career was as an actress, so I trained to be an actor, and I never intended to be a writer. So I wanted to act from the age of 12, and I did act. But when I went to drama school, I discovered that there were no plays by or about Black people or Black women in drama school. And I went to a drama school called Rose Bruford College, where you were trained to create your own theatre. So you were trained to act, but also to be a theatre maker. And so that's how I began writing, through the course that I was on. It was never my intention. Eventually I stopped acting and working in theatre and continued to write. But I would say that the most important text for me when I was a young woman, when I was at drama school, was what's called a choreo poem by Ntozake Shange called For Coloured Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough. Once you know that title, you never forget it, right? It's very long-winded, but it was a production that happened somewhere in Berkeley, actually, in California, and it was a collaborative effort with various women in the 1970s, and Ntozake Shange then wrote the sort of script of it. But if you look at it on the page, it looks like it is poetry. So she called it choreo poetry. And what happened was, when I was at drama school, I went to see a production of it in London's West End. And it's a sign of the times that I remember the theatre was nearly empty. But it wouldn't be today. Today people would be fighting to get tickets. But it was such a phenomenal production, because there were 7 Black women on stage talking about aspects of their lives through poetry and dance. So it was very fluid, very experimental, completely unlike anything else that existed in theatre, I think, up to that point. And I was young. I was a young woman. I was at drama school. I was writing because we had to write as part of the course. And when I started writing for theatre, it came out as poetry. I never called it choreo poetry. It was kind of verse drama, if you like. So I think that text was the most important thing for me in terms of inspiring me as a theatre maker in my early years.
Thank you.
I was thinking of, ooh. Wait that out. I was thinking of plays that I actually read when I first went to high school, but by that time I had decided to be a writer and then had decided not to be a writer. I had already embraced and rejected the idea of being a writer by the age of, let's say, 14. I think my early influence was children's literature, and specifically two things. I was a subscriber to a magazine called Cricket Magazine for children,
know that
which
one.
still
Yeah.
exists, although in the 70s when it was first founded, it was really extraordinary, almost like kind of a movement. People like Isaac Bashevis Singer were contributing to Cricket. I mean, it was a truly excellent literary magazine that was aimed for 5 to 13-year-old children, kind of along the lines of like what Sesame Street was, founded in 1969 as like a social movement disguised as TV. And I was an early subscriber to Cricket, and it had a little fiction contest in the back for different age groups, like 5 to 8 and 9 to 12. And so I was obsessed by winning the fiction contest in the back of Cricket. And I wrote very derivative fiction based on what I read in Cricket, and also my very favorite series, which was called The Borrowers, which was about very small people who steal things. And so I wrote an original series called The Pinheads, about even smaller people who have to borrow smaller things. And then I realized how derivative this was, and by 14 was wanting to be an actor, actually. But I did not have the talent that I think Bernardine must have had, because I didn't go very far.
Did you find your inspiration in the theater?
No, I never wanted to be an actor. In fact, my knowledge of how unrealistic a dream that would have been was probably no small part of what made me want to write. Like I was drawn to writing precisely because I felt so uncomfortable in my own skin in life. Never mention inhabiting somebody else in front of a group of people. It wasn't actually a book that made me want to be a writer. It was, I was in college, and I had absolutely no aspirations to write. I was not a voracious reader when I was younger. I took a sculpture making class, and at the beginning of each session, the teacher would give us a slide presentation, sort of the history of sculpture. Just a real scan. And he showed us 2 images of Joseph Cornell's work, the American sculptor. And I don't know what it was. It just scratched something inside of me, something really primitive. And I went to the art library and looked up a book of his work, which was something sort of out of character with the person I was at the time. And I became really properly obsessed with his art. And the first book I ever assembled, you'd asked me how many books I wrote. I forgot about this one. I didn't really write it. I edited a book of writing inspired by Joseph Cornell's bird boxes. But I remember thinking I would love to try to create something that would make somebody feel like this makes me feel. And I don't know that I cared if it was writing or visual art or anything else. I had no facility with anything else, and writing has a kind of flexibility, I think, that other art forms don't have. It's not really, despite being a teacher who teaches in one way or another the craft of writing, it's not really a craft. It's more it has something to do with charisma and perspective and self-expression as I think about it and do it. So it had a flexibility to allow me to experiment with trying to create that experience for somebody else.
Yeah, these visual narratives that you've spent time, that have inspired you. And in your books, your recent books, Bernie and Susan, they also spend some time in the theater. I've also spent time in the theater. A lot of us have spent time in the theater. The experimental black boxes, lots of imagination, a lot of creating dissonance and harmony, and lots of young people feelings and costumes, and and all of you have also had your books translated or connected to other kinds of narrative formats, movies, television, radio stories for the BBC. Has the performance of your stories, seeing your stories as moving image, the visualization of your writing into figures and form affected or changed how you've approached writing through your careers? Because, you talk about wanting to recreate an experience through writing, and then yet we're cycling back to kind of making a visual, something visual. I wonder how that's, if you think about that at all.
Well, I wrote for theatre as distinct from writing books, but although I have various things in development at the moment, my work hasn't been created into theatre or on the screen yet. So I haven't actually had that experience. But I can talk about being a visual writer, which I am, and actually I'm also very inspired by visual art increasingly. I find myself in galleries and seeking out the kind of art that I think will nurture my imagination. And in London, for example, we've had some amazing exhibitions in the last year, which I have just found absolutely mind-blowing. And I'm very aware that when I go to these galleries, that I am feeding my imagination, and I know that I am working towards doing something similar with my writing when I start to write my next novel. And I'll say what these exhibitions are. There's one called In the Black Fantastic, which was on at the Hayward Gallery at the South Bank, which is one of the major galleries in London. And it was an exhibition of 11 artists, some of them American, who were exploring futuristic art, if you like, who were blowing the boundaries of reality and creating extraordinary pieces of art in all kinds of visual art genres. And it was just so stunning and staggering that I went back several times, because I was like, how do I do this with my next novel, which I won't go into detail about that, but how do I create something so visually, amazingly mind-blowing through fiction? And another artist called Hugh Locke, who is a British Guyanese artist, who had an exhibition at the Tate Britain Gallery, which is another major gallery in London. And he produced a piece of work called The Procession, where he created all these carnivalesque figures that are quite grotesque and incredibly imaginative, and drawing on multiple references to do with British history and society in the Caribbean, slavery, colonialism, everything thrown in. And it was hugely successful, and I felt the same about that. So as a writer, I feel that I do draw my inspiration from other writing, but I'm increasingly feeling that I need to go beyond literature to be inspired in terms of my own creative practice. But also as a writer, when I wrote Manifesto, which was published in America last year, I was looking at my creativity. And one of the things I kind of thought about and interrogated in the book was the fact that the origins of my creativity come from my background, which is a biracial, interracial family growing up at a time in Britain when it was a very white environment. And also from my Catholic upbringing, because I grew up in the Catholic Church. I went to a convent school for the first 4 years of my life, went to Mass 5 days a week. I went to church on a Sunday for 10 years, went to confession. I was literally absorbing through osmosis the language of the Catholic Church, which was, especially the church that I went to as a child, the High Mass, very poetic language, very rich language, very ritualistic service, very Rococo in every way possible. And that actually has shaped me as a writer in terms of the kind of language that I have created, poetry, but also very rich and majestic language. And then I also think about my parents. My parents were very political. My father was a very political animal. I grew up in a family where we were socialist and believed in changing society. I mean, especially my father, he was a local Labour councillor. My mother was a trade union rep. So I grew up in a family where if you didn't think society was working as it should and was discriminatory in all kinds of ways and hierarchical in very negative ways, then you change that. And as a writer, I'm somebody who is committed to being a voice in the world, to creating a more egalitarian future. And then I come to the theatre and, you know, imbibing language as an actor from the age of 12. Especially Dylan Thomas, Under Milkwood, which was a play for radio, which is also very poetic, and I played Captain Cat in a school play when I was 14. And so not only was I reading this language, but I was also performing it and becoming it. And then for those of you who came to my event yesterday, I was talking about how when I started writing for theatre, I was inhabiting my characters. So I was writing for theatre and then inhabiting the characters. And that has shaped how I write character and continues through to today, inhabiting the characters, really experiencing them from the inside and then communicating them in a quite performative way through fiction.
It's so interesting to hear you speaking about the contemporary art that's... I can't tell whether I should raise my voice or lower my voice. I'm going to try this again. Raising it? Doing without mics? Oh, that sounds right. I was interested to hear you talking about the art you've been looking at, and actually, Jonathan, this role that Joseph Cornell plays in your creative life, because I also find that I'm always kind of struggling to figure out how to do the things that I find done so viscerally by visual art in my writing, because I'm someone who has always experienced the world very imagistically and very atmospherically and very, very much in a way that I'm constantly preoccupied by time and the passage of time. And I'm also very preoccupied by environment and space and how the spaces that we occupy affect us and our memories and our relationships. And all of these things are actually like not that easily managed through prose, I find. Like I always find prose to be a really limiting medium to be working in if you're really interested in atmosphere and time. Because prose is generally linear. It kind of, you write sentences and they run in one direction. And narrative often seems as if it only runs in one direction, although I'm always trying to figure out how to like run it in other directions. And so I have a lot of not negative, but I have a lot of jealousy toward other media, like passionate jealousy toward painting or photography or film, because I always feel like, oh God, they're really engaging with these things that I wish I could engage with more directly through prose. And I'm also, I've been thinking about a visual artist that I discovered recently a couple days ago in Los Angeles, Uta Barth, who's a photographer who works with duration and light and makes these images that are really about time and the passage of time. And her work is so moving. And Frances Alice is another artist whose work, in the way it deals with like experience of time, I've found really remarkable. And I don't know to what extent I succeed in learning from these artists in terms of my own writing, because I always feel as if it just points up the ways in which working in fiction feels strangely limiting to me, but it is kind of like that's my toolbox. It's like all I've got, really.
You know Hiroshi Sugimoto's
No.
photography?
Oh,
Does anybody know Hiroshi Sugimoto? He's an unbelievably great photographer, and you could have been describing his work the way that you were speaking about the passage of time. He's probably most famous for photos of movie screens in classic old movie theaters, the kind that don't really exist anymore, but there's still probably a couple hundred of them in the world. And he would take a photo, the shutter would be open for the duration of the film, and that was the only lighting in the film. So the whole screen would be white, just the accumulation of all of the light of a story, of a movie, and it would emanate from the screen in this kind of ghostly way. And he was actually the second artist who really changed my life. and also in college. And I wrote him a letter, and I said, hi, I'm a great admirer of your work. Here are the reasons why it has meant so much to me. If you would ever like to collaborate on something, please think of me. And I had never published anything. I don't think I'd ever completed a piece of writing. Maybe 4 years later, I still had not published anything, but I was out of school. He sent me a letter.
No.
And he said, I'm putting together this catalog, and I need somebody to write an introduction. Would you like to do that? And we've since made 2 proper books together, like real collaborations.
That's so cool.
So you should always write a letter. Truly. Something you were saying about jealousy felt so familiar to me. The late Russell Banks was a teacher of mine. I was in the last class he ever taught. And he said something in our first class together, which I've always thought about, which is every painter harbors a secret fantasy of being a writer, and every writer harbors a secret fantasy of being a painter, because painters, according to Russell, painters always want to mean more and are frustrated by their inability to just mean something in a more straightforward, literal way. And writers are always frustrated by their inability to escape straightforward meaning, to create an atmosphere or an experience that doesn't always go from tick to talk, as I think you said, and can be evocative without referring to anything. I have found that of all the many, many struggles I have had as a writer, that's been the greatest struggle, actually, is how to, if my goal, as I said, was to make somebody feel like that art made me feel, I've been frustrated trying to generate a feeling with so much explicit meaning behind it.
See, the thing is, you describe these struggles and this attempts at creating an atmosphere or resisting the linear, and yet all of you play with that conventional linear narrative arc that we as readers expect. I mean, you guys kind of frustrate us sometimes, right? You surprise us. You weave through time and place as a narrator, how we think about chapters, the coexistence of different centers of the world, different people, writing from those different centers, so we see a world or a community as more of a constellation, not the singular place. I'd love to hear a few more thoughts about how you think about and use structure and that knowing fragmentation and disruption in your writing. How does it emerge? Is it about wanting to argue with your reader or struggle with the text itself? Is it the joy of, I've always actually, I don't love writing, and I'm actually okay at it, so it's always frustrating. Is there pleasure in kind of trying to break apart these norms that we've learned in school and through reading older texts? And
I mean, always a pleasure in breaking up norms, but should we stick with our traditional order? We don't have to. But I feel like we've developed a norm, and now
institutionalized ourselves.
I am an experimental writer, and I've written. I don't know if I've written a traditional novel, so-called traditional novel at all. And even when I was writing for theatre, it was coming out as poetry, and it was very experimental. And back then, all those years ago, I didn't want to fit what I wanted to say as a black woman into traditional British theatre tradition in any way. So I was definitely rebelling against the status quo and the more traditional kind of theatre that was around 40 years ago. And then as a writer, I have developed my own styles, but they've been very hard won. So anybody who's read, which is more likely people have read Girl, Woman, Other here, will see that this is a very experimental novel with these 12 characters, and they're kind of relationships with each other. It's what I call effusion fiction with what I call a pro-poetic patterning on the page and so on. But that book began as that, but with a lot of my previous books, they've begun in one genre and ended up in another. And for many years, I did try to write a more conventional novel because I was very aware that that's what people want to consume. And I'd gone from poetry to verse fiction, and my first verse fiction was actually a prose novel, which I worked on for 3 years because I wanted to write a big baggy novel. And I literally took the manuscript and threw it in the bin in those days before you had memory discs and memory sticks and the rest of it. So I literally got rid of the manuscript and then turned it into a verse novel, and that's when it started to sing. One of my books, Soul Tourist, which was published in 2008, is my most formally experimental novel in the sense that there's poetry in it, prose poetry, scripts, and other non-literary devices. But actually, I spent probably 2 years working on it as a traditional novel, and it didn't work. And what I found was that when I was trying to be conventional as a writer, my love of language, I lost it. It was like my writing became very flat, prosaic, unimagistic, uninteresting. But I kept trying to fit myself in. At a certain stage in my writing career, Ian McEwan was in Britain, heralded as the great British writer. I was thinking, I need to write like Ian McEwan. Even though I came from this radical, experimental background, black British background, I was still trying to force myself to kind of fit in. And it's kind of a bit embarrassing to say this, because anyone who sees my work will think, oh my God, she's so experimental, she does her own thing, and it's true. But the process to reaching that point was one where I was battling against what I thought people wanted to read. Because not only was I writing about demographics that didn't really feature in British fiction at all, barely still today, but I was also trying to reach as wide an audience as possible. And so what happened with the novel Soul Tourist was that once I started to experiment, the language came alive, and then it became its own thing, this very formally experimental novel. And so it has continued right through to today, at the point at which I write Girl, Woman, Other, and then it just all comes together in a very natural way. But the problem with that novel was that it was a very free-flowing writing experience. It took me 6 years almost to write. But when you experiment and when you get rid of the full stop, as I almost did completely with that novel, you also lose the structure that you need for a novel. So the first couple of drafts were just completely wild. And it was very, very hard to tame it and discipline it to create a novel that people could read. Because the full stop just does just that. It stops the reader. It gives you a structure. Sentences actually give you a structure. And when you have like 120, I think originally 130,000 words with not many full stops, it's just like, oh my God, what have I written? I don't know what I'm doing. I can't see what I've done. And then it took at least a couple of years to discipline it and to create something that was readable. And to align all the different timelines, because there's 12 characters over 120-something years. And each characters are in each other's stories at different times in their lives. So it became a really technical exercise. And I'm not a technical person at all. So it was a huge challenge to bring it all together. So that's me talking very honestly about this process of becoming free as a writer and the sort of obstacles that I faced.
That was a beautiful success. As a reader, I mean, I was very satisfied. I was like, how did she do this? This is, it's wonderful to hear how that emerges.
I know all three of us teach, right? You teach, I teach, Jonathan teaches. I think we've discovered like an amazing pedagogical tool for the teaching of fiction, because I too was once told by my editor I had written a book that I was really proud of, and it got good reviews and sold a few copies, and my editor had clearly expected it to do better. And she said to me, of my career as a whole to that time, well, you're just going to have to write your atonement. And then, and then the implication was, and then everything will work out for you. And I'm not sure if everyone in the audience knows that Atonement is Ian McEwan's breakout novel on this side of the ocean. And boy, was that the worst thing I could have ever heard in that moment. And actually, through a chain of unrelated events, I actually stopped working with that editor. It wasn't owing to any decision that I made, but she switched publishing houses, and I thought, well, that's okay. But there was something about being told that I needed to write my atonement that was so vexing and distressing to me, and I labored for so long under this sort of angry, I felt very combative and thought well, hell no, I'm not going to, or maybe I should, or I couldn't even if I tried. What the F am I going to do about this? And I really do think that it bothered me so much that I did end up a full book later writing a book that was very, very unlike any book that I had written before, Trust Exercise. And by that time, I'd happily forgotten the "you'll have to write your atonement" comment, and it wasn't until after the book came out, it was compared to Atonement by an interviewer, which was both horrifying and kind of vindicating. So I was like, all right, so I did write my atonement. But I don't think I could have done it if I hadn't been so mad that I swore I never would. So just, let's tell our students that and see how damaging it is in the short term, and then maybe productive in the long term.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a teacher, the thing that I find myself battling against the most is students writing what they think they should be writing as opposed to what they are inclined to write, what they want to write. I don't know, for me, a lot of things which probably seem like choices don't feel like choices when I'm making them. I find a lot of writing to be just about survival mechanisms rather than stylistic decisions. It's just really hard to write a book. I can't think of anything that I could do that would be more difficult for me to do in the realm of things that are possible to do. And one of the things that's very difficult about it is a tension between what do I find compelling, what do I find interesting, if only enough to stick with it, and to stick with it at a level of care that's required. And what both of you have mentioned and what I would mention too, which is an awareness of readers. And it's maybe more pleasant not to admit to that, or it seems more noble not to admit to it, but it's just true. And you had mentioned wanting a larger audience. You will not find a writer who doesn't want a larger audience. There are good reasons to want larger audiences, and there are bad reasons to want larger audiences. A good one might have to do with what you were speaking about, your upbringing, a desire to change the world and to introduce a voice that you feel will be generative. A bad reason is because it makes you feel good. But again, I don't think you will ever meet a writer who doesn't feel better with more readers. I've never met such a writer. So on the one hand, you're dealing with something that is such a personal struggle to how many things in life can you maintain a high level of care about over years? It's really difficult. Children is one that I knew somebody would say. If it, people have a very hard time doing it in romantic relationships. Maintaining that degree of care. Professionally, I think it's almost impossible. So you're going to have to contort yourself. I find that I have to contort myself in all kinds of ways in order to make myself care at that level. And writers have found really weird techniques for doing this over time. Like Joyce would invent affairs, for his wife to have, because the rageful jealousy was adjacent to his creativity in some way. So on the one hand, you're doing that. On the other hand, you do have an awareness of the fact that it's your profession and that you are a member of a community, and because writing is such a personal act, it's hard for a blank page not to, maybe this is what I mean. it's hard for a blank page not to feel like a reflection of a blank person, and it's hard for a book that nobody responds to feel unworthy of a response. And so wanting to be somebody who is not empty and wanting to be somebody who is worthy of a response, it's a really, really difficult balance to strike. And a lot of the things that I do in my writing are just usually like subconscious attempts to strike that balance.
It's really interesting. I did have this question of, do you write for your reader? Because I'm a curator, and I know that artists don't necessarily make art for audiences, but they would love to sell their work, right? And, Bernie, your recent book, it felt like this book of portraits woven together in the most satisfying way, and yet Blonde Roots, for example, was a test of my own bias and unsettled understanding of race through satire. And Jonathan, and Everything Illuminated, made a lot of people angry, but a lot of people loved it. And Susan, Trust Exercise pulls the rug out from under you right way through. And, to be frank, you've all written books that have had these polarizing effects on readers to frustration, but some people delight in it. Someone like, I delight in that. I like being challenged. Who is your ideal reader? What do you think of us? I mean, you started answering that, but,
Barely know you.
Well, I think we know in the UK that men don't read books by women.
Mm-hmm.
There are statistics to prove that. Not many men read books by women, which of course is really problematic. And we know that women will read books by any gender, and that the major book buying demographic is middle-aged and older women in the UK, especially for fiction. So when you're writing, I try not to think of an ideal reader, because they then become, they kind of limit what I can write, because I'm starting to write for somebody's approval, right? And I don't want to write for anybody's approval. I want to write the stories that I want to write, and that's it. But at the same time, at the back of my mind, I know that that is the majority reader in my country. I mean, my work is now out there in the world in an amazing way, so that's kind of different. But for me, it's about staying true to the story that I want to tell in the way that I want to tell it. But at the same time, I am and have been a very provocative writer. As you said, Blonde Roots is a very provocative book. I've created a world where Africans enslave Europeans, and it's satire. It's very hard-hitting. It's also a satire, so it's funny, but it's also tragic in some ways. And I think some people probably do take offense at, some of the stuff that's in the book. I sometimes wonder if Girl, Woman, Other's a bit cozy.
Mm-hmm.
Is it cozy? When it kind of broke through the barrier and started to reach what we call Middle England, I was like, no.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, it is a radical, experimental, queer, inclusive novel about black women. It's not cozy. But it because it won the Booker, it reached beyond my usual readership, I think. And people then found a way into reading it and to appreciating it, which was very interesting. Years ago, when I started writing poetry, I wanted to make people cry. I was in my tragic 20s. And the whole thing was to make people feel my pain, right? And then by the time I got into my 30s, I discovered my sense of humor as a writer. And that's something that I've maintained throughout my career. And I know that through humor, I can win people over. Humor opens people up emotionally. When you write fiction and there's humor in it, people then become more receptive to what you're exploring, and also more emotionally open to some of the difficult things that you're also exploring. I'm very aware that that's how I think it works. But essentially, it is about staying true to my own creative vision. And that's what I have to think about when I'm writing a book, and try and sort of, blank out all the noise that's around that, in terms of readership, in terms of sales, and even in terms of what my editor might say. We have the same editor in the UK, myself and Jonathan, Simon Prosser. I wouldn't be writing the books that I write if Simon hadn't published me for the last 20-something years and taken every book that I've written. He's never said to me, this was, the atonement thing was inside me.
Yeah.
He would never want me to write like Ian McEwan, he wants his writers to have their own voice.
That's a good editor.
Which is great. So those are some of the sort of responses to that area.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's always hard to at least explain to students and also to audiences is and I feel like I'm hearing this from both of you too, but at least for me, there are like these highly contradictory realities that are equally the case. And one is that I write entirely for myself without thinking of the reader ever. And the other is that I'm always thinking of the reader. And and I often say to my students, like, there are just going to be two things that are completely contradictory of each other. You have to hold them both. Write entirely for yourself, and you are writing to be read. And it's really difficult to reconcile those, but maybe you shouldn't try. One thing that I also often think is that, I can tell when I'm trying to write for some imagined reader. I can't imagine the reader. And so when I'm trying to write for a reader, I know I'm going wrong because I don't know who you are. I don't know the reality of other humans. I only know my own. And so I think for when I know I'm on the right track, it's when I feel like I am writing what I really want to be writing. And so I'm going to be writing for the reader who finds that compelling. And I hope that person's out there. And being authentic to myself is kind of the only path forward, I guess. And students often want to be told, like, well, what do people want to read? And you just, it's a game we'll never win, and so you just have to kind of write the thing that you really want to write and hope that there's someone out there, maybe more than a few people who want to read it.
I think the way to reconcile those two incompatible ideas is to believe that the other is somehow like you. I'm going to really, really mangle this, but James Baldwin said wrote something along the lines of, and I will get to the spirit of it, but apologies for not sounding like him. I used to think that the things I felt most most alienated me from others, because who could be depressed as I'm depressed? Who could experience joy as I experience joy? And then through the discovery of literature, I found that the things I feel most deeply, most strongly connect me with others, just not the others I had thought. And that's very much been the story of my writing career. People I thought would like what I write really often don't at all. And people I would have thought would have nothing to find in my writing. Why would such a person care about a 20-something-year-old journey to Eastern Europe to find the person who might have saved his grandmother during the war? The strongest connections are sometimes made from the furthest distances. Yeah. And so I think you can have it both ways, to say I am doing this only for me, and I believe that somebody out there will feel that I was doing it only for them.
For them, yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's really beautiful. I have one final question. We just have 2 minutes, and this is kind of a big one, but Jonathan, there's an obvious politics in your recent nonfiction, making a powerful case for changing our everyday habits in the face of climate change. And I think there is certainly a politics in Susan Bernardine's books, particularly in regards to gender and power and race and being seen. How much do you consider your poetics of writing as a kind of politics? We might only have, moment for 1 or 2 of you, but I just felt like there's so much about the 3 of you here and the kinds of histories you delve into that seem, very much about shifting the culture of what we read and the kinds of characters we read about, that feels like a very important part of, how we are now.
I suppose, the politics and the aesthetics are intertwined. That's my answer.
Yeah, and I would say, back to what Jonathan said about how it's really difficult to sustain passionate interest in one's own work over time, especially the time it takes to write a book. I think all of my books that I've ever managed to finish have sustained my interest because they were about a problem that I was trying to work out, some kind of problem, and almost always that problem has been political in nature.
And I hope we can talk a little bit about that more later, too. So, any last words?
The Polish poet Zbigniew Herbert said something that I really loved, which is the imagination is the instrument of compassion. That, you can argue with somebody until the sun goes down, and in my experience, it very, very rarely excites compassion. I mean, it can excite anger and defensiveness, and it can become a game where you want to win rather than lose. But it's rare that an argument has changed my life, and it's the opposite of rare that a work of art has changed my life. That's happened many times. And I just think it's the best way to open up a problem. I completely agree. It's like the old saying, once upon a time there was a person whose life was so good there's no story to tell about it. Every story is about a problem, and the world is overflowing with problems. And it is not the only way, and it's maybe not the best way, but it's a necessary way to confront problems.
Well, thank you all. Thank you.